Readers and viewers of Embassy Direct, happy month of August, here when we celebrate Women's Month. We are here today with two excellencies, Ambassador Vuyiswa Tulelo in Vietnam, in the city of Hanoi, and Her Excellency Charlotte Lobe in the Lion City, Singapore. Good afternoon, ladies, this morning from South Africa.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shezient, my big sister, Sister Lobe from Singapore. My name is Vuyiswa Tulelo, and I am South Africa's ambassador, or as they say in this part of the world, Daisu, to the beautiful land of Uncle Ho, Vietnam. I'm happy to be part of this conversation this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Excellencies. And just to say, before I introduce myself, that Ambassador Rodrigo Chiari was posted in South Africa at least twice, and he has done a lot of work in promoting the relationship between South Africa and the people of Panama. So I thought just to fit you into the whole story. So he is somehow has been baptized to be a South African. My name is Charlotte Lobe. I am the High Commissioner of South Africa in Singapore. Myself and Ambassador Tulelo are part of this region with great Asian tigers. And part of the work that we continue to do is to collaborate between the two of us in appreciating the difference as well as the commonalities in the kind of cities, countries that we are accredited to.
Thank you very much for your introductions, ladies. And may I ask you, as our first question, you have already been in this part of the world for more than 2 years, if I'm not wrong. And could you share with our readers and viewers at Embassy Direct, how has been that experience for two heads of mission from South Africa in this part of the world?
Okay. All right. So for me, it was quite an adjustment. First, you have to understand that I come from a very, very small part of South Africa in Kimberley. So I'm a small town girl, right? I don't do well with many people. Even moving to Johannesburg was a bit of an adjustment for the system. And so I was then posted in New Zealand, which there's more sheep than human beings. So I was in heaven in New Zealand, right? And I enter in Hanoi and my whole body just shut down because I had never seen so many people in my life. Were just everywhere. And so it was an adjustment to get used to the idea that people are everywhere, people keep moving, nobody stops to wait for you to cross the road and things like that. But it was also very refreshing politically to come to part of the region that was so instrumental in changing the trajectory of South Africa's political discourse, to be able to see the places and the faces that we have only learned about as part of the South African history. So a lot of us have been growing up in the youth movement would have made reference to the Green Book, to the 4 pillars of the struggle within the ANC. And it was such a wonderful thing to come to where these ideologies or ideas were conceptualized and were born, being able to walk into Ho Chi Minh and see the Coochie tunnels and understand when the phrase is used to say, let the people be the forest of the revolution, what it means, because you realize that what the Vietnamese had to contend with during their wars of fighting. And it's such a wonderful thing to be able to see that. And also just to learn about how much the Vietnamese as a people had to go through in terms of forging their own identity and then transporting that into what they so aptly call as their bamboo diplomacy. Because for the Vietnamese, it is important to look at what is the strategic objective and the outcome you're going to get from somebody that you enter into a partnership with. It's not so much that they don't understand the ideological differences, but it's that they appreciate that even when there are ideological differences, there are some goals that you can achieve in the objective of transforming the lives of their people. And so I found myself now being a Vietnamese because I cross the street without looking left or right. I don't wait for the robots anymore to turn green. But also I've come to appreciate so much more the work ethic that the Vietnamese people have, because I've never seen such hardworking people as Vietnamese. Every little inch, because Vietnam is a small country in terms of land mass, right? But every little inch of the country is engaged meaningfully to ensure economic diplomacy and ensure that the people of Vietnam are not suffering. And these are some of the things that I am so excited to bring home to South Africa, because we have so much land, but we are like, oh, this land cannot be used because it's not that, it's not that. But the people in Vietnam, they don't do that. They look at what they have available and they say, what can we do to make the best out of what we have available, and not what we have available and what it's not good for.
Thank you so much. And I must add, yes, I have been a few times in Vietnam, and I was really amazed the first time I visited. I was expecting a place devastated by war, but totally something different. A place where, as you say, those people are noble, those people are strugglers, and they have come with an incredible country. And back to my friend Charlotte in Singapore, is to share a bit of what we experience here in this city state.
Well, it has been a great experience. And let me start by saying that when I received my letter to come to Singapore, I think I was in a state of shock because of the work that I was doing before coming to Singapore. As I've always said, my work in DECO before coming to Singapore was more into the areas of women, peace and security. So I had expected that because of the work I was doing on generation equality, the work I was doing with the focal points network on women, peace and security, that I would be posted at least in a conflict zone. So I had expected to be posted maybe in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, in northern part of Africa, or maybe in Latin America. But unfortunately, wishes are not horses, and I found myself in Singapore. I embraced my posting because I saw it as an opportunity to learn and somehow diversify my knowledge into new areas of work. And this had meant that I needed to at least learn a lot about issues of economic diplomacy and how best I can be a representative of South Africa in a successful country as small as it is, that is Singapore. So when I came, I really had to hit the ground running simply because with the work that I had to do, with the briefing that I was given by the authorities in South Africa, there was no slumber time for me. I had to go knock at doors and ensure that Singaporeans and people living in Singapore see that South Africa is back in business. And so I did that. I went to different places. And as Madam Vuyiswa has said, with their diplomacy on the other side of our region, here they have two types of diplomacy. One is called a durian diplomacy that they practice among the ASEAN countries because when they share durian, to them it's like in Nigeria when Nigerians would share a kola nut with a fellow friend and be a symbol of friendship. But they also have another form of diplomacy that they practice with the rest of us. They call it they call it after their national flower, the orchid. So they call it orchid diplomacy. So through orchid diplomacy, they make sure that when they have high-level delegations like Nelson Mandela, they would have a hybrid. So in other words, they start some sort of a cross-pollination from the start, and
develop this flower, and they choose the colors that the flower should come out with. That would represent something that means a lot to a head of state or a dignitary that they are going to honor. In our case, they honored Nelson Mandela when he was here in 1997 and gave him an orchid, and it had the stem had green, it was yellow, it also had a bit of a black. So it represented the ideal that Mandela stood for and the colors that best represent Nelson Mandela. So when I came here, I had to understand that Singaporeans were embracing people, and they are what I would call a networking nation, in that they try by all means for you to succeed and for them to succeed in a network of friendship.
Correct. And I totally agree with what you said, Excellency. And I must say, for those who don't have the honor and pleasure to know Charlotte Lobe, actually I met her here for the first time in Singapore, and she's doing a beyond excellent job, which I'm sure Ambassador Tulelo is also doing in Vietnam.
With the help of Ambassador Tulelo, most of the things I do here, we do together.
So you work like a girls' team, and I'm sure that your country is very proud to have you here. And talking about your country, let's share now with those people that are not necessarily in South Africa to understand the celebration of this month as the Women's Month. The role that woman has played in the history of South Africa is something that few people really know. We always talk about the big names, and suddenly they relate to men. But we have had a lot of interesting ladies like Winnie Mandela and like Madame Sisulu, which did great for your countries. Please elaborate about this topic of women in South Africa.
You wanna go first, Big Sis?
Yeah, I can. The story of South African women in the struggle for liberation dates to the early 1900s, where the South African women, even before the ANC was formed, the African National Congress, they marched in Bloemfontein, my hometown, and they were marching because they were opposed to the introduction of Paslow back in 1910. And because of their own struggles and identifying injustice in the system in 1912, of course, the ANC was formed, and in 1913 they took their struggle to the highest level because they managed to mobilize women from around the country in 1913 to now have this big march and talk about injustice, etc., etc. But if you look at the formation of the ANC, there was one woman in the room at the time of the formation of the ANC, Miss Charlotte Manya Matreke, who, according to the historic prescripts, she was even more educated than most of the men who were present in that room on the 8th of January, 1912. Now, this already tells you a story of South African women who are determined not only to succeed as persons, because she also represents excellence, but stories of South African women who have taken it upon themselves to be part of the struggle for the liberation of our people. The story goes on and on and on and on. And we, myself and Ambassador Tulelo, are part of a generation that came years later and who were fortunate enough to have experienced the harshness of the apartheid system, as well as experience the formation of a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it. Now, through that march of 1913, the march of 1956, South African women have always been in the forefront of the struggle for liberation. If you, for example, would remember that we had very great women who were part of nation building in the ilk of people like Dr. Frini Ginwala, who was a Speaker of Parliament, who in her own role played key roles in building a South Africa that we can be proud of today.
Thank you.
And I think I just wanted to tag along and say, maybe the first point to make that High Commissioner Lobe mentions the presence of Manye Matlake at the first founding meeting of the ANC. One of the things that I found when I was posted in the US and I was serving in the Midwest, I was based in Chicago, but I was covering 12 states of the Midwest. And one of those states was Ohio. I had not known this before when I was back home. I found out that Matle had studied at the Wilberforce College in Ohio, right? And based off the relationships that she built in Ohio, she then went back to South Africa and had a college started in South Africa, which was called Wilberforce, which is kind of like a partnership agreement between Wilberforce College of Ohio and the Wilberforce College in South Africa. But it's part of the stories that we do not get to be told in the bigger scheme, because I only found this out when I was posted in the Midwest, but I had known about Charlotte before I left South Africa. But I think it also tells the story of how women are an integral part of the transition of South Africa, and how women have been the backbone of the liberation movements and even currently the reconstruction and the development of South Africa as we see it today. And one of the things that I have come to appreciate a lot coming to Vietnam is that the Vietnamese women do not assert their influence in the public domain. They assert their influence behind the scene. And you will not see a Vietnamese woman out and about and think that maybe she's not, they're not making the contributions that are needed to send the country in a certain direction. But that's something that I'm learning to appreciate. And it takes me back to the role of the women who were at the forefront of the transition of South Africa, because those women, unlike myself and High Commissioner Lobe, did not have the liberty to represent and speak for themselves as freely as we can. So they had to influence from behind the scenes, right? And so when they did come and forge together to make an open statement around how they were unhappy about the introduction of the pass law, one of the beauties about that march is that it transcended political, class, cultural, religious, and race affiliation. Women were able to come together. And because of that, women showed the men, right, that you can choose to be very systematic with your corporations, that when you need to do something, you don't always have to find people who look like you or people who think like you. You need to find people who understand the challenges that you're doing and who are able to either become an ally, or become an advocate, or who are also just suffering the same way that you are suffering. And celebrating Women's Day in South Africa for me is a constant reminder for not just for us, but also for our young women who are coming up, that the benefits and the freedoms that the women currently have, they did not come easy. They did not come because women who just walked into a boardroom and said, hey, we would like equality, right? That's not what happened. Women had to lay down their life. And as you correctly say, Ambassador, that when you look at the history of South Africa, when you look at the history of the world, the role of women is pushed so far back that it creates the illusion that men are the only ones that have been in the forefront. So when you have these days where women claim their own space and say, we want to be acknowledged, we need to celebrate the bravery of our forebears. We need to celebrate the victories that were attained by those who came before us. It's a reminder for us that what we are enjoying today did not come automatic. When I entered into the diplomatic service, so I try not to go back to the other world where I was causing trouble, but when I entered into the diplomatic service, one of the things that I was told was that women who were in the diplomatic service had two options, right? One was that you do not get married and you can stay in the diplomatic service, and then you can qualify to get a posting. The second one is if you do get married, you will never get a posting and you will never rise in the echelons of the foreign service. You will be a secretary, you will be an accountant. That's where you will end. But it is the battles of the women that we are celebrating from the 1956 movement who have made it possible for me and High Commissioner Lobe to be able to not only be able to be posted, right, in representing our country, but to be posted at the highest echelon. I mean, sometimes I tell people, you don't understand what it means to be the head of mission. It's not just that you are in this country and you are going to meetings. You are the voice, you are the eyes, you are the ears, you are the feet of the president. Whatever you say is understood to be coming from the president. And imagine that task that is on your shoulders, that you have to think that I cannot make a mistake and say something wrong because it's going to be attributed to the president in South Africa. And to think about it, that just about 25 years ago, we would never have had this opportunity as women. We would have never had this opportunity. We would have had to choose whether we want to become diplomats or whether we want to become mothers, right? This point, I am a single mother and I am sitting in a foreign country with 2 children representing the president of South Africa at the highest level, not because of my intellect or because of my capacity, because of the work that was done by those women. And so when I enter into the month of August, I do so very consciously of how many women had to lay down their lives, both literally and figuratively, to allow me to get to where I am. And I am very deliberate in my decisions to make sure the next generation of women will even have a better time serving. We now have to deal with having to, diplomacy is a man's world, right? People, for some weird reason, expect you to work from 8 o'clock until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they expect you to go to all these networking engagements after 5 o'clock. As a mother, when are my children going to eat? When are my children going to see me? But with a man, they don't think that way because the wife is home. So we actually need the wives, right? We need wives to be able to do these things for us. But it's in the context of this evolution that we have to make sure that the next generation of heads of missions who are women will not have to make the choice between spending time with their children and executing their responsibility as heads of mission. That the world of diplomacy understands that as a woman, you are entitled to be a head of mission and to be able to represent your country. But it doesn't mean you have to choose between being a mother and being the head of mission. You can do both, just like the men can do both, because they have the support of the women. So we have to create support systems that make it possible for women to excel and matriculate in this responsibility as equally as men do. But that is the task that High Commissioner Lobe and myself are besieged with, because we have to lay those founding rocks for the next generation of young women, just as the women of 1956 laid the rocks for us to be able to take over the mantle of representation on behalf of the president.
Thank you, Ambassador. And yes, you're mentioning about actually part of my last question, which is in relation to the role of women today, both in diplomacy and leadership. When I first arrived to South Africa in the year 2000, I remember that I only met 2 heads of mission female that I can remember right now, one from Egypt and the other one from Kenya, 2 great friends that I still remember. And later, when I came back in the year 2009, the numbers increased. And nowadays, because I engage with them both in South Africa and Singapore, the female diplomatic population in the level of heads of mission have increased happily in a nice number. So what is at this point your take on the fact of that role played by women, both in diplomacy and leadership, especially in the African continent?
Can you repeat the latter part of the question?
Yes. what is the role today of women in diplomacy, as well as in leadership, but especially in Africa?
Well, I think in our world that is fast changing or fast paced, there is a need for more women in leadership positions, not only in our field of diplomacy, but also in other fields. Just in the field of diplomacy, if I may start there, with the tensions in our geopolitics, I still believe that the involvement of women in trying to find solutions to the problems that is faced by the global community today can go a long way in assisting the global community to move out of the current impasse. And I am going to make a few examples that can showcase what I am talking about. You would remember that one of the roles that South African women has played in the processes of our negotiated settlement was for them to stand in between as people who would say that we want this not only for us, but we also want it for our children and for future generations. So their involvement that they fought for, because it was not given to them on a silver platter, had meant that them stepping into the negotiation processes, they came with a perspective that ordinarily would not have been part of our negotiated settlement. They understood that negotiations were not purely about the people who needed to lead, but it was also about the kind of policies that the people in leadership were going to be armed with, whether it's matters of education, it's matters of the economy, it's even matters of defense. They wanted a formula that would serve the people of South Africa. Now, moving into our countries, you would notice that the South African women were involved in facilitating peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. Me Mbeki, through the South African Women in Dialogue, facilitated sessions between women of the DRC because she believed that if women could speak from the same level of understanding, it will be easy for us to win the other people into peace negotiations. And they had several sessions at the Sun City. I'm sure you are aware of the Sun City negotiations of the DRC. And at that time, the very first sessions did not have women. But through the work that we South African Women in Dialogue did in promoting idea of women's participation in matters of this nature, they were able to facilitate greater participation of women. But also just thinking outside of conflicts and all that, just think of elections. That majority of people who vote in any country, in any part of the world, are women. Even in the elections that we've just had in South Africa, if you look at the statistics, you will see that majority of people who went out to vote were women. Now, that means that with women being majority of voters, whether as a part of our population statistics or their will to go out and make their voice heard, means that as you make determination on who should lead, who shouldn't lead, that the voice of women should always be included. Because if you don't include the 52% of the world population in leadership and decision-making structures, what then happens is that in majority of cases, you are going to have a situation where 52% of your population is not involved in the conversations that are supposed to take your countries forward. So that is the second thing about election and being elected. Electing and somehow participating in the structures beyond elections. The other issue that I would want to mention is that in most cases where you have women representation, and this is part of a number of reports by the World Bank, by the UN Women, that proves that when women are involved in conversations, they bring a perspective that would have been ordinarily left out of those conversations. So they bring on the table matters that may have been forgotten or may have not been seen as that important or worthy of being discussed in these big tables. But as I always say to the South African women is that if you are not invited to the table, it is 2024, create your own table and invite others into your table, because you can't fold your arms and say, I'm not involved. They don't involve us in leadership discussion. They don't involve us in the contemporary conversations. Create your table, discuss contemporary issues, and invite others into those conversations. So the importance of women's leadership cannot be overemphasized.
I think I tend to look at the role of women in leadership and diplomacy specifically from a kind of different lens, in that the vocabulary and the lexicon of diplomacy is male dominated, right? The language we utilize to engage, to reach the agreements that ordinarily will be facilitated by women, does not even recognize or acknowledge their contribution in the final document. So when you look at how the Vienna Convention has been put together, the Vienna Convention speaks to the aspirations and to the input that men are making. We can definitely say 70 plus years later, this Vienna Convention has not necessarily been able to bring the outputs that the men who negotiated it expected it to bring, right? All the interventions that they have put in place somehow have not been able to last. However, we have seen that the work that women do, whether it is on a bilateral level, whether it is on a multilateral level, whether it's at the sectoral level, the work that women do seems to be able to bring a lasting relationship. So I think for me, one of the things that we do have to step back and look at is to say, how do we revamp this curriculum, if you will, that governs the world of diplomacy, to be able to recognize that women are not just passing by through the process, but they are an integral and a fundamental part of the negotiations that will be going forward. I think it's wonderful that we have women that are heads of missions that are in the increase, right? But as the example that I just made, it does not help us when you have 50 women who are heads of mission in a certain country, but you are still having receptions that are taking place at 10 o'clock at night. Because the assumption is that those 50 women do not have other responsibilities that they would like, by the way, not that they are forced. They don't have other responsibilities that they would like to be engaged in terms of the family. So we have to look at how do we set up our method of operation to be able to reflect the needs of women. Because again, not all women who are going to be heads of missions are going to be 50 years, right? Mm-hmm. We cannot operate like you are dealing with a person whose children are now independent and then he doesn't need them. But there is a reality. When I entered the world of diplomacy, I was nowhere next to 40 years, and I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. So that is the reality. Now, it means for me, because we are fighting so hard to create a space for other youth, the next generation of heads of missions that are going to enter are going to be far younger than I was when I entered the world of diplomacy. Now, it means they'll still be in their childbearing age. They will still be in the age where they want to start families, where they want to get married, where they would like to celebrate milestones with their children. So how do we put together a space which will recognize those things? That's the first thing to me. The second thing, I think that we we tend to oversimplify the issue of leadership of women in Africa because we are talking about public leadership, because we are talking about political spaces. But I think we need to celebrate the role of women, even at the local level where there's no focus on them in terms of public awareness. The work that women do, the work that High Commissioner Lobe is talking about, if you see how these women have been able not only to negotiate peace and stability in their country, but they've been able to band together to start projects that will bring about economic freedom in their countries and their livelihoods. And we realize that when there is economic freedom, chances of discontent and disruptions are much lesser because people don't have to fight for the same piece of pie, right? People are engaged elsewhere. But as soon as the economic position gets a little bit shaky, then you get also the impact of destabilization being on the increase. So we need to be able to look at that to say, when we speak about leadership, are we speaking necessarily only of the public leadership, or are we speaking about the even behind the scenes leadership? Because even these men that go out and take up these places and become revered leaders, these men come from homes that have been bred by women who had elected not to be in the public's eye. So we have to be able to celebrate that, to say, when we, the ideal, for me, the ideal situation would be when we get to a situation where government policies will not have to be reminded all the time, what about the female voice, right? When government policies will be passed and will be able to recognize that you have a 52-48% population. So whatever policies that you have to do are in the interest of creating a stable environment for those for your citizenry. Then I think it might be able to take us a little bit forward and help us to celebrate each other a little bit more. But I also think that we do have to speak about the discourse of intergenerational conversations that are happening between women, which are not recognized, right? And I'm sitting here, High Commissioner, and I'm just thinking about, if we look even in the space of diplomacy in South Africa, if you look at the conversations that we are having with people like Mam Tenjiwe Mtinzo, right? Who is an icon in her own right, but who's also done some amazing work as a diplomat. And how you bring this. You look at the work that was done by Mama Nkosazana Zuma, not only as a diplomat, but as a minister that led us to where we are. How do we forget celebrating the last minister that we had before the transition in South Africa, Dr. Pandor? She is celebrated and revered because she was able to stand on a principled position without creating opportunity and space for discontent and for violence to erupt. Because she was able to stand up and say, but as South Africa, we are standing with those who are voiceless, with those who cannot speak for themselves, but we will follow the proper procedures. And these are the intergenerational conversations that are happening that are not necessarily being focused on by the world at large, and creating an impression that women are not engaging each other to celebrate each other. The work that you do, Charlotte, how do we not speak about the work that you do to record the history of women and make sure that women are not erased out of the history and their contributions? These are things that are not seen because you don't do them to be in the limelight. You do them behind the scenes, but also to be able to create a reservoir of knowledge so that the next generation of women can come and tap into that and say, oh, these are some brilliant minds. Because yes, there are women, there are 3-4 names that we all know about, but there are so many more names that we do not know about that need to be celebrated. So when we celebrate the role of women, both in diplomacy and in leadership, my sense is that we have to look at it broader than the public sphere that we are accustomed to engaging with, and say, what is it that women do? Firstly, to be able to create an opportunity for leadership and leadership of integrity and leadership of quality to emerge into the public space, right? That's the first contribution that they make. But also, how do they take up leadership without necessarily being in the public eye, that they are taking the leadership in terms of being able to influence decisions and not necessarily claiming that those are their decisions. And then we can speak about women in the public space and say, how is it that women are being seen in the public space? Because if you only focus on the women in the public space, there are so many other layers that we are leaving behind. And these are the women that are propping those of us up who are in the public space. Because behind me and behind our Charlotte, there are so many other women who are not seen and who we do not want to celebrate, because everybody's looking at us and say, she's the ambassador. But there is a system, there is a network. And even with the decision that our Charlotte and I take to say, we are not going to operate as if we are independent beings. We represent the same country. We are in the same region. We can learn from each other. There are things that she can get that I can't get in Vietnam. There's information that is pertinent to the work that I do in Vietnam that my channels in Vietnam would not give me, but they will give it to her in Singapore. So if we do not have a connection between Singapore and Vietnam, I'm losing out on that bit of information, even though she's not representing Vietnam. But there's the same thing that there's a CG who is in Shanghai. There's a bit of information that she can get from us that she's not necessarily aware or privy to in Shanghai to help her enable in executing her job. So I think women leadership, it's about just that. Women about a network. We are a wraparound system. And to be a wraparound system, you have to be aware of the hands and how far those hands stretch to bring you to the circle that brings in women in leadership. I hope I've answered it kind of in a long-winded way.
Well, thank you so much for both of your contribution today. Unfortunately, time is our enemy, but I would like to wrap up just saying that South Africa has nothing to fear, having two ladies like you representing them in this part of the world. You are doing a great job, ladies. Continue with your task. Do it with the same pride that you have been doing it until today. A happy Women's Month to both of you. And I'll give you half a minute to each one to bid farewell to our readers and viewers.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rodrigo, for the opportunity to come here and talk on this issue that others regard as a small issue. To us is big and deserves engagements from time to time on how best we can take it forward. I am looking forward to our summit in the next week. I can't wait for the work that you are doing here next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rodriguez, to inviting me, even though I'm not invited to your summit. You see, now I feel like the outcast. But thank you for...
It shall be corrected into the future.
Please, please. Yeah, but thank you for inviting me to the conversation. And I think a special thank you for showcasing that women can decide to collaborate. We are not victims of the PhD as people purport, that, women can't work together. When they are together, they always fight. Thank you for showcasing that we can actually be very deliberate in collaborating and working together. And I think the stories that High Commissioner Lobe will share with you tomorrow will be a testament to that last year, as both our countries of representation were celebrating 30 years of diplomatic relation with our country of origin, we were able to pull together an amazing feat of events celebrating that 30 years, starting from the economic side, looking at the youth, looking at the women, and ending up at the high-level deputy president engagement. And that's what happens when women decide to collaborate, right? Doesn't mean that we always think the same thing. There are things that we have completely different, but once we have identified what that objective is and the target is, we are solely focused on that and we make that happen. And thank you for being part of that, to showcase not only to the world, but to other female ambassadors that when you are in the same region, make the best of that time, collaborate. We are in a period of shrinking resources, so maximize the little resources that you have to be able to have the biggest impact in the interest of your people and your country.
Thank you very much once again.
Thank
Good afternoon.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.